Silver Crown by Robert C. O'Brien, Chapter 11, Otto the Knife. "They make you look like a boy," Otto said. He was not paying a compliment, but just making an observation. "What does?" Ellen said. "The pants and the shirt. Girls wear slacks all the time. You're old-fashioned." "That's not what I meant. I meant in case anybody was watching." "Watching what?" "Watching us when we left the house. They were looking for a girl. If they thought you were a boy, they'd give up." "That's true," Ellen said. "I hadn't thought of it. Except your hair looks like a girl's hair. You should wear a hat." "I don't have a hat." "I know." They were walking steadily along the two tracks of the road. Ellen on the left, Otto on the right. They had come perhaps 2 miles since leaving Mrs. Fitzpatrick. The morning was still cold. Birds sang over their heads, and their spirits were high. Here the road led through oak trees, choosing its way very carefully where the great trunks were far enough apart for it to pass. It was taking them slowly upward toward a pass between 2 high mountains, so that on either side the ground and the forests sloped above them as far as they could see. A small brook had picked almost the same path, bubbling along parallel to the road, sometimes leaving it for a while, sometimes flowing right across it, so that they had to leap the water or pick their way carefully on mossy green stepping stones. "We could cut it off," Otto said thoughtfully. "Cut what off?" "Your hair. We don't have any scissors. I could do it with my knife." He pulled the knife from its sheath, as if he planned to start then and there. The idea of Otto hacking at her hair with a knife did not appeal to Ellen at all. "You could not," she said a bit tartly. "Anyway, we're already out of sight, so it's too late." "You don't need to get snotty about it." "I'm not, and don't say snotty." "Why not?" "It's a vulgar word." Otto faced a dead end. He changed course. "See that spot?" He pointed with his knife at a circular scar on a tree trunk about 15 feet ahead, where a limb had fallen off. "Yes, the round one." Otto drew his arm back. The knife blade flashed to the sunlight, and a point buried itself deep in the middle of the round spot, like an arrow in a bullseye. He did this so quickly, Ellen's eye could hardly follow it. "How did you do that?" she asked in astonishment. "It's easy," Otto said. "I can do it every time." He ran to the tree and pulled the blade out. "See that skinny tree over there?" He pointed to a sapling perhaps 2 inches in diameter. Again his arm moved in an incredibly deft motion, and the blade was in the sapling, humming softly. "Let me try," Ellen said. "You won't be able to. It takes practice." He was right. When Ellen threw the knife, it struck handle 2 and clattered uselessly to the ground. She tried again with the same result. She gave it back to Otto. "Do it slower," she said, "so I can see how." "I can't. When I do it slower, I can't do it." "How did you learn?" "I read in a book about a Chinese murderer who killed people by throwing knives at them. It was neat. No bang or anything. The people just fell down dead. And the Chinaman also always got away before anybody knew what had happened. His fingerprints would be on the knife. He wore gloves. Anyway, I drew a picture of a Chinaman on a plank and tried throwing a pocket knife at it. Pocket knives are no good, though. The handle's too heavy." "But how could the Chinaman in the story get his knife back?" "He didn't. He just left it in their hearts and got another one. He had boxes of them. Then I practiced with an ice pick. That worked better, only it was too light. It wouldn't go very far. Then I got this knife. I practiced for months, almost every day." "It's sort of dangerous." "No, it's not. I mean, I'm not going to throw it at anybody." "You'd hurt them if you did." "Hurt them?" said Otto scornfully. "They'd drop dead." They kept walking as they talked, and in another mile or so the trail leveled off. They had reached the top of the first pass, but ahead they could see much higher mountains rising, some with rocky shoulders too steep for trees to grow on. From where they had stood they could not see how or where the road crossed these, but it was leading straight toward them, so it was clear that they had a climb ahead. Still, if wagons had made it, so could they. Richard stayed with them, sometimes riding on Otto's shoulder, sometimes flashing from branch to branch above them, like a blue-black shadow. Every now and then he vanished entirely for 3 or 4 minutes, flying a scouting expedition ahead or back off through the woods to one side. When he returned to Otto's shoulder after one of these, he always squatted quietly as if to say, "I'm back." Along the way, Ellen found a blackberry bush growing beside the road and lagged behind Otto for a few seconds to pick up a handful of berries. As she set out again, she felt a rustle of wind on her cheek, heard a small voice say, "Eat!" and Richard, back from a mission, had settled on her shoulder. She held out a berry, and the black bill tweaked it gently from between her thumb and finger. She called to Otto in delight, "Look at Richard!" Otto obviously felt quite proud of Richard. "He likes you," he said. "That's the first time he ever sat on anybody's shoulder besides mine." As for Richard, he was interested primarily in the blackberries. He gripped Ellen's shoulder gently, his talons tickling slightly, his soft wing feathers brushing her cheek, until he had eaten all the berries she had. Then he flew back to a bush to pick some more on his own. But from then on, he was as likely to settle on Ellen's shoulder as on Otto's. She got used to feeling the puff of air and the sudden light weight. The sun rose higher and beamed through the trees with steady intensity. Even in the mountains it grows hot at midday in summer. Ellen took off her sweater. She found herself seeking out the shady side of the road where when there was a shady side, and felt her blouse grow wet with sweat under the rucksack. Small clouds of gnats hummed around their heads and got in their hair, ears, eyes, and noses. With Otto's knife they cut switches off leaves to fan them away, which helped a little bit, but not much. Then the level stretch of road ended. Just ahead it began rising steeply, and the oak forest became mixed with pine. Off the road, to the left, the brook ran through a shady grove. "It's lunchtime," Otto decreed. "How can you tell?" Ellen said. Not that she disagreed, but neither of them had a watch. "The sun's straight up, so it must be noon. Anyway, my belly knows." He patted his stomach. "That's a vulgar word, too," Ellen said. They walked over to the brook, unloaded their rucksacks gratefully, and sat down. Their legs were tired, and Ellen rubbed her ankle, which, strangely, had not hurt at all while she was walking on it, but started to now, though only a little. They selected food from their stores, biscuits and raspberry jam and a couple of hard-boiled eggs, sprinkled with salt. They drank fresh, cold water from the brook, remembering to refill the water bottle. Since they had hiked hard all morning, everything tasted delicious. And after lunch, they lay on their backs and looked at the sky through the trees. "What's your Aunt Sarah like?" asked Otto. "Old or young?" "Young. She's not even married yet." "That doesn't prove she's young. She might be an old maid." "She is not," Ellen said. "She'll get married when she gets older." "Who to?" "How do I know? But I know she will. She's pretty. She's beautiful." "Is she rich?" "I don't know. I guess so. She has a big house and 2 maids and a gardener. When I grow up, I'm going to have millions of dollars. Then I'll build a big store, an enormous store, right near my mother's house. It'll have everything in it: food, clothes, dogs, guns, firewood, cars, beds, and cokes." "A department store," Ellen said, "but they don't have cars in department stores." "This one will, and everybody who buys anything will have to pay. So I'll make even more money, except my mother. When she wants anything, she can just walk over to the store and pick it out. When they try to make her pay, she'll have a special card that says she can have it free." "Like a charge card," Ellen said. "What's a charge card?" "It's like what you said. You go to the store and buy something, and when it's time to pay, you give them a card with your name on it that says, 'Charge it,' but they send you a bill later, so you have to pay anyway." "They won't send my mother any bill. I'll tell them not to. It's my store." "I wish I had a card like that," Ellen said, thinking of all the big stores she had been to and all the things in them. "Okay, you can have one too, and I'll have one, but nobody else, otherwise I'll lose money." "Thank you," Ellen said. It did sound like a nice idea, but she remembered what Miss Fitzpatrick had told her about Otto. Still, it was a generous sort of dream. They repacked their things, shouldered their rucksacks, and went on. They were refreshed by the lunch and the short rest. Even so, they set out at a considerably slower pace than they had in the morning. The trip no longer seemed so much like a picnic, but rather more like a forced march. Even Richard was less inclined to swoop about. He was content to ride, looking rather drowsy, on one or the other of their shoulders. As the road rose higher, the oak trees disappeared behind them, and they walked through a deep, dark green pine forest. This was a stiller kind of woods, with fewer birds. The pine needles muffled the sound of their footsteps, and they walked in silence. The road turned rocky underfoot, and more frequently they saw great gray stone outcroppings and steep rock cliffs where nothing grew at all. At length they came to a place where a huge pine tree, uprooted by the wind, had fallen across the road. Although it had long been dead, its spiny branches formed an impenetrable barrier, and they had to detour around it. Otto said, "That proves nobody goes over this road anymore. They would have to cut the tree away." And yet, a minute later, curiously, he found he was wrong, for when they walked into the woods to go around the tree, they could see there was a definite path already there. "Maybe animals made it," Ellen said. "It might be a deer track." But Otto, who knew quite a lot about tracks, found, in a place where the pine needles had been scuffed away, a curved indentation. "That's from a man's shoe," he said. "A heel mark. I know it is." And Ellen, when she looked closely, could see that it did look like one. A little farther along the path, Otto found another bare spot where there were several more of the tracks, all the same size, as if they were made by the same slices, some curving in one direction, some in the opposite. "Somebody walks back and forth through here," Otto said, "but not very often or there'd be more tracks. You can hardly see them. You can hardly see some of them. They're old." And this was puzzling, because since leaving Mrs. Fitzpatrick's early that morning, they had seen no sign of a house nor any human being. Now the road changed again, and to Ellen's mind at least, changed much for the worse. Where it had been following a high valley so that the ground rose on either side, it now deserted the valley and clung directly to the mountainside, following a natural ledge or shelf, cut out of a very steep, very high slope. In fact, in places it was not a slope at all. A cliff rose sheer as a wall on their left, and fell straight down on their right. It was the straight down that Ellen didn't like. It made her dizzy to think about it, much less look down it. And she walked as close to the left side of the road as she could, picking her way carefully so she would not stumble, since the road was narrow here, and there were loose rocks lying all over it. Otto was not bothered in the least. He strode fearlessly along the edge, and occasionally, when the drop-off was particularly steep, picked up a large stone and tossed it over the edge. Then they would listen, and sometimes it seemed as if a whole minute went by before they heard the clunk as a stone crashed on other stones far below. Ellen did not much like this game, but what really worried her was this: if the road continued this way until dark, they would have to stop walking for fear of stepping over the ledge, and then where would they sleep? The ground underfoot was nothing but hard, sharp rocks, and anyway, who could sleep when just turning over might send you flying down a cliff? So she watched uneasily while the sun turned from white to orange and then red as it sank in the evening sky, and as the great shadows of the mountains crept up like black clouds over the forest in the valley below. She walked grimly on and made Otto keep walking too, although both their legs were tired now and their feet felt like cinder blocks. At last they came to a curve in the mountainside. Ellen thought she saw far ahead a glimmer of green near the road. Another half-mile and she was sure of it. They were coming to the top of this particular shoulder of the mountain. The steep slope flattened out, and there was forest again. They staggered the last few hundred yards in silence, turned without a word off the rocky road into the pines, and fell exhausted onto the brown carpet of needles. But after a few minutes of resting, Otto's energy began to return. He propped his head on one fist. "I wonder how far we walked," he said. "How can you tell?" Ellen said without moving. "There's no way to measure how far you walk." "Yes, there is. You measure how fast you walk, how many miles an hour, and then you figure out how long you've been walking, and then multiply." "Sure, if you know, but we don't know how fast we walked, or how long either." "I bet we walked 50 miles. "Not that far," Ellen said. "Soldiers can only march 30 miles a day, even when they train every day. I read it in a book." "We've got to make a fire," Otto said. "Yes," said Ellen, "in a few minutes, but not here." "Why not? You can see it from the road. I mean, in case somebody's following us. We've got to move farther back into the woods." So they rested a little longer, and then walked another quarter-mile or so to a spot where in the thick forest their fire would be invisible. There was plenty of firewood lying about, for the pines around had shed their lower branches. Otto scraped away all the pine needles from a wide circle. Pine needles burn fiercely, and can set the woods afire. Then, using a handful of them as tinder, he got a blaze going, using only a single match to start it. They put some of the dried beef in their cooking pot, added some potatoes, which Ellen peeled and sliced up with Otto's knife, and some water, and in a few minutes the clearing was filled with the warm smell of beef stew. They decided to ration their water this way: 1/3 for cooking, 1/3 for drinking, and 1/3 for tomorrow, since they could not be sure when they would come to another brook. They ate the stew, all of it, even though they had cooked all the pot would hold, and sopped up the gravy with more biscuits. They had not enough water to wash the pot, but Ellen wiped it dry with a clump of green pine needles. Then they fixed their beds, Otto showing Ellen how to roll up her blanket, first piling pine needles under one end of it to serve as a pillow. When darkness came, they slept. Ellen woke up once during the night. She heard someone moving, but it was only Otto putting some more wood on the fire. Richard slept high in a pine tree.